Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, we have recently discussed boiling down the teaching of the Buddha into as few words as possible. And I have come up with another challenge since then along the same lines.
What is it?
If you could summarize what the Buddha says we ought to do in as few words as possible, what would you say? This is different from summarizing his entire teaching, but rather speaks only to what actions the practitioner ought to take based on those teachings.
Another tough challenge. I would say that the Buddha would tell us that in our morality, we ought to act based on wisdom and compassion. This wisdom and compassion ought to be cultivated through meditation, which we ought to observe with vigor and diligence. What would you say?
That's a very interesting answer. I would say that he would tell us that we ought to act purely out of wisdom, because those who are wise act compassionately and practice meditation vigorously and diligently.
Also a good answer. I have no doubt that there are many interpretations on this topic.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the Eightfold Path in depth. What is the Eightfold Path? What role does it play in Buddhist practice? How have understandings of it changed over time? We hope you enjoy.
So, what is the Eightfold Path?
As a continuation of our in-depth look at the Four Noble Truths, I thought that because we have established a solid foundation in many of the moral arguments of Buddhism, we would return to the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is pointed to in the Fourth Noble Truth, which is that the end of suffering is the Eightfold Path. In Sanskrit, the Eightfold Path is called the Aryashtanga Marga. In Chinese, it is called the Bajongdao. In Japanese, it's called the Hashodo. As we have discussed before, the Eightfold Path breaks up the individual's life into 8 distinct domains, which ought to be turned toward the Buddhist path. These 8 domains are categorized into 3 categories. The moral division, known as Shila in Sanskrit, contains right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The meditative division, known as Samadhi in Sanskrit, contains right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The insight or wisdom division, known as Prajna, in Sanskrit, contains right view and right resolve. The Eightfold Path, like the Four Noble Truths, is one of the earliest and therefore most ubiquitous teachings in all of Buddhism. It is first mentioned in the Sutta, or the first sermon, which we've read and discussed, and it's a summary of what one ought to do to overcome desire and therefore overcome suffering. It is the most succinct formulation of the way to achieve liberation from samsara and achieve nirvana. It is the Buddha's answer to the question, what ought we to do? While at first it seems extremely simple, it actually is a very loaded and fraught formulation, and so we should discuss a little bit more about it here. You might notice that each and every one of the 8 divisions has the adjective right in front of it. Buddhism has a very specific answer to the question of what is right in this case. This word right is often interpreted by Buddhist modernizers to actually imply moral relativism, for example. When people are co-opting Buddhist ideas into their own frameworks, they often interpret this right to actually mean whatever is right according to your own individual moral compass. This is basically self-help nonsense based on morally relativistic interpretations of karma, and is problematic for all the reasons we've talked about in the past on this show. So I want to point out here that we are explicitly not talking in terms of moral relativism. But I did want to point out that there are different interpretations and often conflicts over interpretations about what this word right actually means and how it applies to the quote-unquote Buddhist path, if we can even say there is one Buddhist path.
What role does the Eightfold Path play in Buddhist practice?
Let's go through each of the 8 and give a brief explanation of what is quote-unquote right for each one according to some of the early texts. In many of these 8 divisions, what constitutes right can be considered to be both an abstention as well as a positive action. This isn't the case with regards to each individual division on the Eightfold Path, but it does happen frequently. It'll become clearer what I mean by this as I explain in the case of speech, which we have discussed before. In the Mahachatari Saka and the Sakavibhanga Suttas, right speech represents the 4 abstentions. These are abstaining from lying, abstaining from divisive speech, abstaining from abusive speech, and abstaining from idle chatter. That means that the positive action that goes along with those things is telling the truth, speaking concordantly, speaking affectionately, and speaking uprightly, or when the time and context for speaking is appropriate. In the case of right action, the abstentions are abstaining from killing, abstaining from stealing, abstaining from sexual misconduct, and the actions are saving a life, giving, and observing sexual propriety. For right livelihood, the abstentions turn to a different form. In the Majjhima-sutta and the Mahachattarīsaka-sutta, they are abstaining, desisting, abstinence, and avoidance of wrong livelihood in one developing the noble path whose mind is noble, whose mind is without effluence, who is fully possessed of the noble path. This is a very confusing formulation, but according to scholar Peter Harvey, it can be boiled down to observing avoidance of livelihoods which cause suffering to sentient beings, and this suffering could be caused to them in these poor livelihoods by cheating them, by harming them, or by killing them in any way. That being the case, people who are hunters, people who are con men, people who are soldiers, people who engage in cheating or in dishonesty or in directly harming a sentient being in any way are not living the right livelihood, according to this division on the Eightfold Path.
So politicians.
Exactly. Right effort is preventing the arising of unwholesome states and the generation of wholesome ones. Again, in the Sakka Vibhanga Sutta, it is presented thus. The monk arouses his will, puts forth effort, generates energy, exerts his mind, and strives to prevent the arising of evil and unwholesome mental states that have not yet arisen. He arouses his will and strives to eliminate evil and unwholesome mental states that have already arisen. He arouses his will and strives to generate wholesome mental states that have not yet arisen. He arouses his will, puts forth effort, generates energy, exerts his mind, and strives to maintain wholesome mental states that have already arisen, to keep them free of delusion, to develop, increase, cultivate, and perfect them. This is the most explanation that we get about any one of these in a kind of specific way like this. He's basically trying to get rid of all of the bad and generate all of the good, prevent all of the bad, and maintain all of the good. And in other suttas, we have very long lists about what are wholesome mind states and what are unwholesome mind states. We'll get into that in other episodes. Right mindfulness is one of the more contentious divisions, especially in early Buddhism. But the agreement is that right mindfulness is practicing meditation free from distraction, delusion, and hindrance. There's dueling interpretations of the correct method of meditation around the time of the development of Buddhism in South Asia. And so I'm going to explain a little bit about the different kinds and how they are treated in the texts. Vipassana meditation, which is actually common in the West very much now with like the yoga tradition, involves observing the instructions presented in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which again we've read and discussed on this show. These involve contemplation of the four domains of the body, sensations, mind, and phenomena. Another kind of meditation that comes later is jhana meditation, which involves overcoming the 5 hindrances and navigating through the 4+4 jhanic states that we've described in the past. Right concentration is how one ought to engage in whichever mindfulness they choose to do, be it vipassana or jhana or otherwise. In Sanskrit, this is known as correct samadhi, and the word samadhi roughly translates to gathering or collecting or unifying, and so it implies proper unification of mind and body to free oneself from distractions, hindrances, and delusions in order to practice meditation effectively. So the borderline between right concentration and right mindfulness is kind of subtle. Right mindfulness is practicing the method correctly. Are you sitting correctly? Are you breathing correctly? Are you thinking about the right domains? Are you navigating the jhanic states correctly, etc.? Right concentration regards concentrating on the right things specifically. So you don't want to meditate on why you think that violence should be done unto all sentient beings. That's a very incorrect concentration. You shouldn't be doing meditation on why you have a self, or why you think you have a self, or evidence that you think suggests to you that you have a self. That's very incorrect concentration. These are concentrations that are diluted, and they are hindered You also shouldn't concentrate on your anxiety. You shouldn't concentrate on your laziness. You shouldn't concentrate on your ignorance. These are other things that prevent the correct mindfulness and imply incorrect concentration. Right view is right understanding, and in short, it implies knowledge, belief, and acceptance of the Four Noble Truths and the three marks of existence and karma. So this right view is something that kind of nests right concentration within it. If you have the right view, then you know what is right to concentrate on, and you know then what is right to meditate on. And if you don't have the right view, then you might be starting from behind a little bit. Right view is essentially buying what the Buddha says, believing what he says, and taking that to be true for all of samsara, all of the world around you. Right resolve, which is also called right intention, right motivation, or right thought, is the resolve to renounce and become a monastic and pursue the path of enlightenment. It's the desire to attain enlightenment for, at the very least, yourself, but in many cases, also every sentient being. Again, in the Sammādimmhi-sutta, right resolve is being resolved on renunciation, on freedom from ill will, and on harmlessness, or ahimsa, nonviolence against all sentient beings.
We could probably do a full episode on each of these individually, but the one that I'm most curious on, just personally, is right effort. And that's simply because that's where I personally struggle. So, yeah, I guess maybe put a pin in that for something to discuss later.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. That's one of the more interesting ones because it really speaks to what the practitioner must be doing all the time, not just when he meditates or not just what his occupation is, or her occupation, of course. It's talking specifically about how you live in your own mind and what you do in your own mind to make sure that everything is wholesome and not unwholesome, because that kind of then governs your behaviors in all these other domains.
And it's a very difficult thing to do just from my own attempts.
Very much so.
So, how have understandings of the Eightfold Path changed over time?
In the early stages of Buddhism, the Eightfold Path was laid out as the path, and it was not really up to a lot of interpretation. Scholars think that it was not until the death of the Buddha and the subsequent collection and transcription and organization of the sermons and the texts that interpretations began to differ with regards to the precise nature of the path of enlightenment. With the introduction of Mahayana sutras, and with sectarian divisions and disagreements and interpretations rising out of the commentarial tradition, every single division on this path became a matter of contention, and even the path itself became a matter of contention as well. That is to say that over time, even in the present day, interpretations of this path have abounded. We've talked about how right mindfulness was a contentious issue. What sort of meditation ought we to do, and what ought we to meditate on? What sort of topics of meditation are appropriate for people at different levels on the path? If you're using meditation as the metric, how do you measure where people are on the path and what they should meditate with? All very complicated and confusing issues. However, the 7 other parts of the path are also highly contentious in the tradition. Right action is a good example of one that also became much more contentious between the Mahayana, the Theravada, and everybody else who was interpreting these texts as they were collected after the Buddha died. As the moral framework of the early teachings is questioned and entirely decimated by Mahayana texts and thinkers, what constitutes right action actually became a matter of serious discussion. Obviously, nonviolence remains a guiding principle for most, if not all, interpretations of moral action according to Mahayana thinkers and Buddhist thinkers at large. But we've talked about how the idea of becoming attached to any one singular principle, line of thinking, or framework for how one ought to act and proceed along the path of enlightenment is critiqued heavily by Mahayana thinkers. For example, the Heart Sutra, which we've read and discussed, completely empties out the Eightfold Path. It basically says that the epitome of wisdom is to know that there is no path, no beginning or end to the path, and no walker on the path. So this presents the question of, okay, if there is no path, if there is no walker on the path, if there's no beginning and end to it, then what's actually going on? What are we all doing? Why are we spending so much time and effort on this? What's it all for? And how do we participate in it, but also believe that it is empty in the sense that the Heart Sutra presents that it is. So this becomes a very complicated issue in history. The result of it is that in some cases, Buddhist morality sometimes does change to moral relativism. We've talked about how skillful means is dangerously close to this moral relativism with regards to what is being done, why it's being done, and what the result of it being done is. It, of course, referring to some action of any kind. So in some cases, you'll see that Buddhist morality centers around the intention of the actor, and the person who's doing the action can say, well, I intended to enlighten somebody by doing this, and it makes it kind of okay, according to later skillful means doctrine. It also sometimes changes back and forth to only nonviolence, but also maybe towards studying the path or attaining Buddhahood or doing things that Buddhas do, right? And so there's different interpretations where nonviolence is taken to the extremes, and like people will carry brooms in front of themselves when they walk so that they don't step on any bugs and kill them. There's also cases where nonviolence is kind of done away with because it's impossible to live a samsaric existence and not undertake some sort of violence either directly or indirectly, accidentally or intentionally. Whenever we were talking about food in a previous episode, we were talking about how it's impossible, whether you're eating vegetarian or vegan or not, to eat anything that has come from wherever it was to you without the death of some sort of sentient being. Either there's been pesticides and fungicides applied to it so that bugs and other pests and vermin have been killed, or the transportation to get it to you has exacted some sort of harm on sentient beings, or in some cases the food itself was a sentient being and now you're eating it, right? And so the impossibility of true nonviolence has been, in some cases, digested by the Buddhist thinker in history and has thus been like abandoned in a sense. They've thought of it as being empty in some senses, and it's not abandoned as an ideal, but it's sort of abandoned as a practical reality, and therefore intention of the doer of the action becomes more highly emphasized than did you kill sentient beings along the way or not? Did you harm sentient beings along the way or not? It's sort of like you have very few options in samsara because it's such a bad situation here. And so what you do will sometimes be harmful to sentient beings, and we can't really count off too much for that because it's the reality of the world we live in. Samsara is depicted as the absolute worst version of a dog-eat-dog world, and we're stuck in it. And so we have to make do with the best we can do here. And so that's some of the ways that this Buddhist morality changes. Sometimes it changes to this moral relativism. Sometimes it changes to intentionality. Sometimes it changes to mirroring the actions of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva. And all of these debates and discussions and interpretations are visible across history in South Asia and East Asia. Additionally, the entire system of the Eightfold Path, not just the morality aspect, but also the wisdom aspect and the meditation aspect, gets questioned and even replaced with some very new frameworks as Mahayana Buddhism develops in East Asia. We've talked about the Bodhisattva ideal before and how popular that became in Mahayana Buddhist thinking around the first few centuries of the Common Era. When this becomes more popular, we see the introduction of perfection of wisdom, which is known in Sanskrit as prajnaparamita, as being the model for awakening. Now, I know that this shares the prajna word with the prajna division of the Eightfold Path, but we should think of this as its own self-contained system, which is actually different and separate from the Eightfold Path itself. There are as many as 52 of these perfections of wisdom, 52 divisions of this path that we're talking about here. But most commonly, we see 6 that are talked about and we read about and we see in history. These are the perfection of giving, morality, patience, vigor, meditation, and insight. You can see that this list has significant overlap with the Eightfold Path, such as the perfection of meditation and of morality, which demonstrates the influence and the importance of that earlier teaching, but it also adds other domains which were not previously mentioned, such as patience. These states of mind, which were not originally present in the Eightfold Path or in earlier teachings of the path, they represent a step on this new bodhisattva ideal, on this new bodhisattva path, But previously, they might have only been thought of as a moral virtue, or they might have been thought of as a wholesome mind state, but they were never elevated to the level of importance that the Bodhisattva path elevates them to, such as being an actual thing you must perfect and do in your own life in order to get anywhere out of samsara, in order to get anywhere with regards to saving yourself and all sentient beings. So this development being the case, and all of this contention being the case, it gets very complicated and difficult to hang on to the thread of the Eightfold Path if you're going to ride the whole history of Buddhism as it develops from the life of the Buddha all the way up to the development of Mahayana, and then Vajrayana later, of course, and all of the developments that we see across history in South and East Asia.
That concludes our discussion of the Eightfold Path in depth. Join us next week where we will discuss Mahakāssyapa. Who is Mahakāssyapa? What role does he play in the text? How does his role change over time? We hope to see you there, and thank you very much for listening.
See you next time. Thank you for listening. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.